At dusk, when Mark trudged back after a day of wandering with his camera, Orion was always waiting at the gate. Their reunions were nothing short of a small storm. With reckless innocence and joy that knew no boundaries, would hurl himself at Mark like a streak of lightning. The first time, the impact knocked Mark flat on his back. On his chest, 30 pounds of wilderness growled like an engine roaring to life. Orion bent down, diligently grooming the dust and road grit from Mark's beard with his rough sandpaper tongue, while Mark lay helpless on the ground, half laughing, half breathless, like a man subdued by the fierce yet genuine embrace of nature. Around the 6th month, Orion developed a strange habit. Whenever Mark came near, he would stand upright on his hind legs, forelegs spread wide, head tilted back as if waiting. The first time Mark tried to respond in kind, it earned him a tetanus shot and a shredded shirt. For Orion, a hug meant wrapping both legs tightly around Mark's torso, claws and all, like a bear trap, but brimming with love.
It's his way of showing affection. In the wild, mother lynxes hold their cubs by the scruff of their necks.
Yeah, great.
Might just be trying to relive that memory.
Could it relive that moment without spilling blood?
Mark bought an old welder's jacket at a flea market, thick leather, sleeves padded. He called it hug training. The sight of a man dressed like a medieval knight, standing in the yard teaching a lynx how to hug properly, must have convinced the neighbors he'd lost his mind. Day after day, Mark held out his leather-clad arm for Orion, letting him squeeze the padding instead of bare skin. Slowly, little by little, Orion learned to retract his claws, to squeeze gently instead of tearing apart. Those months left Mark looking as if he'd just come out of a blender. Photography clients eyed his scratches and asked if he'd taken up some new extreme sport. Bill Morrison only shook his head and grumbled, "City folks are crazy," though Mark had grown up just 2 counties away. Then, one late autumn evening, a miracle happened. Mark returned from a long trip to Glacier National Park, frozen, exhausted, and empty-handed after missing the photo he had chased for weeks. Orion was waiting at the gate, standing tall on his hind legs, arms wide open, amber eyes glowing in the dusk. Mark hesitated, tempted to fetch his protective gear. But then he stopped. Something in Orion's gaze, gentle, trusting, pulled him forward. He stepped into it, opened his arms. Orion moved in with uncanny grace, his paws wrapped around Mark's shoulders, claws sheathed, body perfectly balanced. No crash to the ground, no scratches, just a warm embrace between man and lynx, something no one would believe without seeing. Mark heard a deep purr rumble in his chest, felt the warm breath against his neck, felt Orion's paws kneading softly, rhythmically, as if working dough made of affection. His eyes welled with tears. "Good boy. Good boy. Orion," he whispered. From that day on, the sunset hug became sacred ritual. 6 o'clock sharp, rain or shine, snow or blaze, Mark and Orion sank into their private moment. Word spread, and townsfolk quietly adjusted their evening walks just to witness it. Nancy from the grocery store brought her grandkids. Bill Morrison dragged his card buddies along, though he still warned, "Don't you dare try this at home. Mark's a special kind of crazy." The local paper soon ran the story. The wild embrace of the mountain man. Photographer and his orphaned lynx. The article spread, drawing curious visitors. Mark politely turned them away. Orion was no tourist attraction, but fame always carries weight. Wildlife authorities took notice, and one crisp November morning, Inspector Janet Rodriguez arrived, clipboard in hand, eyes calm but firm. "Mr. Henderson," she said, after checking the enclosures, papers, and vet records, "you understand that Orion is nearing the age when he must be returned to the wild, don't you?" Mark's heart sank. He had dreaded this day for months. "He's too bonded with humans," Mark pleaded. "Out there, he wouldn't survive." "That's exactly the problem. Janet replied, not unkindly. A wild animal accustomed to people becomes a danger to itself and to anyone who can't tell the difference between a rescued lynx and a wild one. She gave Mark 6 months, until spring, to prepare Orion for release or find him refuge in a sanctuary. Mark threw himself into research, calling sanctuaries across a 1,000-mile radius. All were full, or refused, because Orion was too humanized. He tried training Orion to hunt with remote-controlled prey. To Orion, it was only a game. He still brought his catch back to Mark, laying it at his feet, waiting for praise. Then winter came early, blanketing the mountains in a heavy quilt of snow. And the story turned a page into a darker, heavier chapter. Mark stood silently before the enclosure, watching Orion slip into the dappled shafts of sunlight on the ground. The lynx's spotted coat seemed to dissolve into patches of shadow and light, making the animal itself part of the forest's silhouette. Orion was truly a living masterpiece, nearly 40 kilograms of muscle and grace, ears tipped with elegant black tufts that twitched at the faintest sound. Those amber eyes could spot a mouse from half a football field away. He was born to belong to the wilderness, yet somehow he also belonged here, in this small space where each evening echoed with the ritual embrace of the man who had raised him from a bundle of downy fur. The way out, once thought closed, appeared one February morning. Dr. Lowry called, voice bright with excitement. A new wildlife education center just opened in Bozeman. They're looking for ambassadors, rescued animals that can't be released, to help communities understand conservation. I mentioned your case. The next day, Mark drove over mountain roads to Bozeman. In the truck bed, Orion lay inside a specially built wooden crate, sturdy yet airy. The Yellowstone Wildlife Education Center came into view across the wide land. Spacious enclosures, a seasoned staff, and above all, a mission that stirred Mark's heart, teaching people to respect nature, to keep the necessary distance from wild beings too often mistaken for pets. The center's director, Dr. Michael Reeves, a quiet man whose face bore the creases of decades spent in the woods, listened to Mark's story, studied Orion's records, and finally looked up. I want to meet him. Mark put on his familiar heavy leather jacket and opened the crate. Orion stepped out, cautious, ears flattened, eyes sweeping across the unfamiliar place. Then, in an instant, he spotted Mark. Like an ingrained habit, Orion rose upright, forelegs spread, head tilted back in that waiting posture. Mark glanced at Reeves. The man nodded. Mark opened his arms, and Orion leapt forward with the fluidity of a stream, curling tightly into the familiar embrace. A laugh burst from Reeves, an unexpected sound from such a solemn figure. In 30 years, I've never seen anything like this. An unusual but perfect arrangement was struck. Orion would stay at the center as an ambassador for his species, helping thousands of visitors grasp the beauty and fragility of the wild. And Mark, he would remain Orion's primary caretaker, driving to Bozeman 3 times a week, both to maintain their bond and to join in education programs. Reeves smiled. We'll put the sunset hug on the tour schedule. It'll be the highlight. The transition, of course, wasn't easy. That first night, Orion paced his new enclosure, growls mixing with the low, mournful cries of an unsettled wildcat. Though Mark told staff he was heading home, he secretly slept in his truck outside, listening to every call. But Orion, like all wild creatures, carried the gift of adaptation. Within a week, he had chosen favorite rock ledges, marked his territory, and begun to settle. The staff quickly fell for him. Orion was half house cat, half wild. He loved crawling into cardboard boxes, pouncing on toy prey, and sometimes sprawled lazily for hours on the cool cement floor. But what amazed everyone was the ritual each sunset. When Mark arrived, Orion abandoned everything, sauntered with that rolling gait, reared up, and opened his arms for the embrace. Spectators behind the barrier froze, then erupted in applause. Mark always reminded them, "What you see today isn't the natural behavior of a lynx. This is the result of a very specific journey and months of patience. In the wild, they're solitary hunters. They don't need humans, and that's how it should be." He spoke about shrinking habitats, about the challenges predators face in the mountains, about the necessity of keeping the wild truly wild. Meanwhile, Orion purred softly, his big paws kneading gently at Mark's shoulders, as if to remind him that this embrace was no longer a training exercise, but a sacred ritual. One evening, amid the crowd, a small girl raised her hand. "Mr. Mark, does Orion love you?" The question pierced Mark's heart like a needle. He stood silent, feeling the warm breath on his neck, the trusting weight leaning into him. Love or instinct? A memory from his earliest days of care. He answered softly, "There are many forms of love. For wild creatures, trust is perhaps the deepest love. Orion trusts me enough to sheath his claws, enough to be vulnerable before me. And I love him enough to make sure he has the best life possible, even if I have to share him with all of you." The girl nodded, eyes glowing as if she had grasped something vast. Time passed, and Orion became a star. Videos of the hugging lynx spread worldwide, drawing millions of views and thousands of donations. Conservation programs expanded. Schools from afar traveled to Bozeman to learn about Montana's wild. But for Mark, all the noise was only backdrop. The true treasure lay in the quiet nights, after visitors had gone, when he sat silently beside Orion in the enclosure, one large paw resting lightly on his leg, like a reminder, don't forget to say goodbye. One afternoon, Dr. Lowry visited the center. She stood outside the fence, quietly watching as Mark and Orion melted into their familiar embrace. "You know," she said with a smile, "the first day you brought him here, I thought you'd lost your mind." Mark gently unhooked Orion's big paw from his shoulder. "And now?" he asked. "Now I still think you're crazy, but in the best way possible," she replied. "You've given him something very few rescued wild animals ever get, a second life, without stripping away what he truly is. He's still a lynx, just one that knows how to hug." The second winter night at the center drew near. Mark sat in his truck, watching the snow fall thick over the Montana Valley, letting memories wash over him. From that white morning years ago, when he first held Orion as a helpless scrap of fur, until now, the journey had become something strange, not wholly wild, not wholly domesticated, but a rare harmony between two worlds. The evening ritual continued, a silent reminder that sometimes bonds across species, fragile and rare, can enrich both lives. Orion taught Mark trust, patience, the wisdom of accepting another where they belong, not where you wish they'd be. And Mark gave Orion safety, purpose, and a bridge between the wilderness that birthed him and the human world that saved him. On windy nights, when the snow draped the valley like a curtain, Mark often saw Orion pacing by the gate before he even shut off the engine. The lynx's restless gait, his high-pitched yowls mixing with deep rumbles, his breath clouding the air, it all awaited the moment before the show. These moments, before cameras or questions intruded, were always Mark's favorite. Just him and Orion, bound by an unlikely friendship, tested through scratches, inspections, and the shifts of everyday life. He opened the gate, and Orion instantly reared up, arms wide. 40 kilos of muscle and spotted fur collapsed onto him, not as a burden, but as a blessing. "Hey, buddy," Mark whispered into those tufted ears. "Did you miss me?" The only answer was a deep, resonant purr that shook his chest. The story spread. A documentary filmmaker shadowed them for half a year, turning their bond into a film screened at Sundance. Biologists wrote papers analyzing the role of cross-species friendship in conservation education. Most importantly, thousands of children left the center with eyes forever changed, with newfound respect for the wild predators still roaming Montana's forests. Then, one early autumn evening, Mark noticed Orion moving more slowly. He had reached middle age, 7 years old, still strong, coat thick and muscles full, but a calm had settled in those amber eyes, a peace no longer found in youth. That day's embrace was longer, quieter. Orion didn't pounce, only leaned into Mark's shoulder, purring steadily, eyes half closed in contentment. Even the crowd sensed something different, falling into unusual silence, as if they knew they were witnessing not a performance, but a rare moment, utterly real. And then Orion did something new. He lifted one large paw and touched Mark's cheek. No claws, just a soft, affectionate tap. The crowd gasped, and Mark's eyes stung with tears. Unable to hold it back, he whispered, "I love you too, my friend." Dr. Reeves, watching from the sidelines, later confessed, in 40 years of work, nothing had ever moved him so deeply. The story of Mark and Orion became the living emblem of the center, a testament that wild animals must remain wild, but that within those harsh boundaries, a bridge can sometimes exist where two worlds meet. It forced people to think differently, instead of dividing wild and tame, to see the fragile beauty that lies in between. And every sunset, 3 times a week, when Montana's sky glowed pink and violet, Orion rose on his hind legs, arms spread wide, waiting for the unchanging embrace. In that moment, the impossible became ordinary. The unthinkable stood real, and love, in all its unexpected forms, found its purest expression. The hug between a man and the lynx who had taught him that sometimes the most beautiful things in life still have claws, but have learned how to keep them sheathed.